What are we discussing on today's Locked on Diamondbacks podcast? Weaknesses of the D-backs this past season that they need to fix heading into 2025. And is Christian Walker coming back to the D-backs next season?
You are Locked on Diamondbacks, your daily Arizona Diamondbacks podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into the Locked on Diamondbacks podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. You're listening to who? The always charismatic host of this podcast, Millard Thomas, multimedia journalist and I'm a graphic designer. So please go check out my website, millardthomas24.myportfolio.com. On there, you can see all my latest work, from my packages to my articles to my photos and my graphic design. Today's episode is brought to you by Booking.com. Booking.yeah. The right stay can make you a fan of any city, even your baseball rivals. Book today on Booking.com, the official accommodation partner of Major League Baseball. Get the Booking.com app today. On today's Locked on Diamondbacks podcast, we'll talk about the D-backs' weaknesses that they need to address heading into 2025, and if Christian Walker is going to be returning to the D-backs in 2025 as well. But first, I want to say thank you for making Locked on Diamondbacks your first listen every day. I would not be able to do this podcast without you, my loyal listeners, sharing, subscribing, reviewing, doing all that so I could do this podcast for you. Thank you. It's free. It's available on all platforms. So please continue to tell your friends. And one of those platforms is YouTube. Please subscribe to Locked on Diamondbacks on YouTube. All right. Let's get back into the Locked on Diamondbacks podcast. And let's talk about the big areas of weakness from this D-backs team in 2024. What were the parts and the offense and the defense and the pitching that failed the D-backs this season? That's what we're going to start off this podcast with in segment 1 and segment number 2. Let's talk about the weaknesses of this D-backs team, a team that was so good for half the season, a team that led the league in runs scored. How did that team that won 89 games not make the playoffs? That's what we're going to talk about today, because the D-backs need to address these concerns if they want to get back to the postseason mix next year. And we're going to start with the offense. We're going to go through each phase: offense, defense, and pitching. And to be honest, when doing this exercise, when looking at the offense, it was tough to find a weakness for this D-backs team. And that might sound a little insane, but we already knew this offense led the league in runs scored, right? Like, we've talked about that a ton on this podcast, how good this D-backs offense has been. Number one in runs scored, the clutchness. They like to score early in games too, right? Well, when looking at this D-backs offense as a whole, there's really not, if any, weaknesses on this D-backs team. If you really filter through any team stat out there, the D-backs are probably going to be top 3 in like everything: home runs, batting average, OPS. You can do splits, runners in scoring position, late in close game situations, sacrifice hits, pinch hitting, like literally anything, whether it's small ball, whether it's power, whether it's, clutchness. Like, this D-backs team destroyed in every area of a game, scoring late, scoring early. Like, there was not a weakness at all to this D-backs offense. They were good against right-handed pitching. They were good against the left-handed pitching. Like, from an offensive standpoint, when you actually sit down like I did today and go through all the numbers, go on every tab on Baseball Reference for offensive metrics, and you see this D-backs team is like top 3 in everything, it just really reinforces the point of how did this squad not make it to the playoffs, because this was by far the most dynamic and most well-balanced offense in the National League. But they did have themselves one kind of glaring weakness when looking at the production from their squad. And the one kind of big weakness is not something that you would have expected from the 2024 D-backs, because it was something that was their strength of 2023. But in terms of the volume The D-backs stolen base totals below league average. In terms of team speed, the D-backs were kinda below league average this season, and it sounds crazy because the year prior, you would have said, like, outside the Cincinnati Reds, the D-backs were probably the fastest team in baseball. I think they were 2nd in stolen bases last year. Plus, you think about their small ball approach and their sacrifice hits and their laying down of sacrifice, bunts and stuff like that. Like, I would have expected once again 2024 for the D-backs to have that speed again, but then that infusion of power, like we talked about with the A. Eugenio's and the Jock Petersons, and the D-backs got that infusion of power, but the speed definitely suffered because of it. Because the Nationals 223 stolen bases, the D-backs only 119. Nationals led the league in steals, D-backs below league average in steals, and last year the D-backs were 2nd with 166. So obviously a lot more steals this season than last season. 223 was the most this year. No team in the National League even had 200 last season. 3 teams this year have 300. So steals are way up this season. But for the D-backs, their steals were way down. And it's not surprised when guys like Carroll stole less. McCarthy didn't seem to be stealing at the same rate. Thomas wasn't there a ton. We didn't have Walker getting his steals. Marte, Perdomo, all guys from last year had big steal totals. We didn't see the same number this season. So you're talking about the biggest weakness from the D-backs this season. It's probably their overall team speed going down a little bit, but I could see that picking back up next season if you send guys like Jake McCarthy and Corbin Carroll and Geraldo Perdomo a little bit more when you get on the base paths. And then speaking of the defense, before we get into the pitching in segment number 2, for the most part as well, the defense was pretty incredible. I tried to go through position group by position group on this D-backs team compared to the rest of the National League. And really, this D-backs defense individually and as a team was really good this season. The one area, though, that I found surprising that by the metrics was a below league average position for the D-backs. And it's the position that I would have thought was maybe one of the stronger defensive positions for the D-backs. Center field between Alec Thomas, Corbin Carroll, and Jake McCarthy, the only 3 center fielders for the D-backs this season. It is by far the worst defensive position by the D-backs by the metrics. Pretty much you filter any advanced defensive stat on Fangraphs, D-backs, center field did not favor nicely in the National League. And Alec Thomas, a guy who we know is elite defensively, the numbers this season tells you that he might have been the worst D-backs defensive center fielder, arguably. But all 3 of them, Jake, Carroll, and Thomas, none of them really graded out nicely in terms of defensive metrics. Ultimate zone rating, all of them were considered negative players. In the Ranger stat, Jake McCarthy was the only positive one at point 0.2. Thomas was at negative 1.6, Carroll at negative 4.5. Outs above average was like the only thing Jake McCarthy at 5 was positive in, and Carroll at 3 was positive in, but Thomas was at negative 1. You looked at just the stat, this is defense. Jake McCarthy, the only positive one here, Carroll and Thomas negative. So according to the defensive metrics, all 3 of them were kind of like below average defenders this season. But also the metrics kind of tell you that Jake McCarthy was also quietly the best defensive center fielder for the D-backs this season. I think based off the eye test, I would agree with that. I think Thomas, despite the metrics saying what they're saying, I still trust him the most defensively. But between Jake and Carroll, if I had to pick one of those guys to be the D-backs everyday center fielder, I think I would pick Jake. A little bit of a stronger arm than Carroll, but not by much. But I do think he has better range. And despite Carroll probably being faster, I just think Jake has better instincts, better jump, and just gets to the balls quicker. And I think the fact that he's a bigger dude as well just helps him overall. So defense overall good. Center field needs to be better. We got to see them improve next season. And the offense overall the best in baseball as well. But if we could add a little bit more team speed, that will go a long way next season as well. And now we'll talk about the weaknesses from the D-backs pitching staff in segment number 2. But hey, if you're planning on going on a little trip this MLB postseason, then the place you want to use to book your accommodations is going to be booking.com, because this episode is brought to you by booking.com. Yeah. Explore those US cities you always secretly want to learn more about, with hotels, bed and breakfast, vacation rentals, resorts, and so much more. In booking.com, you might just find your perfect stay even in your baseball rival city during postseason. Maybe it's time to taste your baseball competition stadium cuisine. Luckily, on booking.com, you can find the stadium stay that's just right for you. With booking.com's wide variety of choices across the US, you can go incognito to all of your baseball rival cities. No matter what team you're rooting for this postseason, booking.com can make you a fan of any US city, even your baseball rivals. Why not check out booking.com today for your accommodations? Booking.com, booking dot yeah. All right. Let's get back to the Locked On Diamondbacks podcast. Now let's talk about the weaknesses of the pitching staff, because the offense, truly no weaknesses outside of maybe a little bit more speed. If you guys could find some for me, drop them in the comments, because for the most part, this D-backs team was great. Also, patience, one of the best walk rates, one of the lowest strikeout rates. Like, this D-backs team, great. The defense as well, great. Outside of center field and maybe slightly third base, Eugenio. I think the metrics say he has a strong arm, and when he has the ball, he can field it cleanly. It just the range of him. He's a little bit of a stockier guy, not as quick getting to balls. But once he gets his mitt on the ball, it's over for Eugenio. So maybe he can get a little bit more athletic as he enters his mid 30s here. But outside of that, the offense and defense were not the issues for the D-backs this season. Really, the point of this exercise was to talk about the pitching woes. And yesterday on the podcast, we talked about Brent Strom and if his firing was justified. And we came to the conclusion that it was, because during his time with the D-backs, we haven't really seen the starters turn into Cy Young winners, right? That was kind of the thing when we signed Brent Strom. He turned Keuchel and Verlander and Garrett Cole into Cy Young Award winners. Well, he hasn't done that with Zach Gallen. Other guys on this rotation staff haven't exactly improved under Brent Strom. The pitching was terrible this season. Easy to see why Brent Strom was fired. And when we go through these numbers, it's only going to, again, reinforce the point as to why Brent Strom was let go, because the numbers for the D-backs pitching staff was bad. And we'll just start here with just the overall traditional numbers of this D-backs pitching staff being terrible this season. Third worst ERA among starters. Not surprising at all, because who of the D-back starters was good this year? I know Zach Allen finished with a good ERA of 3.65, but I still don't think it was a great Zach Allen season. Despite him having a 9.5 strikeouts per nine and 3.65 ERA, I don't think it was a great Zach Allen season. So no one from the starting rotation. Ryan Nelson had a pretty good year, still finished with a 4.24 ERA. So no one had a great year from the rotation. Third worst bullpen ERA as well. Justin Martinez was really good from the bullpen. Had a couple other guys have nice seasons, but Martinez definitely hit a little bit of a wall as we entered the final stretch of the season. Still has some command issues as well. Bullpen, you look at some of the individual numbers, fine, but the overall team success of the bullpen, not good at all. And just the D-backs pitching staff, again, third worst average and whip allowed with runners in scoring position. And so that's just the introduction to let you into the foray, get your feet wet into this conversation about how bad the D-backs pitching staff was, because there's four things I think this pitching staff needs to do to really improve for next season. The first thing they have to do, we need to allow less hard contact. This D-backs team were allowing rockets off the bat of opposing hitters. Fourth worst hard hit percentage in the National League. Second highest exit velo allowed as well. So basically, when guys came into the building, every batter on average was like Shohei Ohtani or Aaron Judge in terms of the ball leaving the bat. Opposing batters were crushing pitches against the D-backs. And when you have high car we have high hard contact stats allowed like that, guess what? It leads to a lot of overall production. D-backs second worst hits per nine in the National League as well. So if you're giving up a ton of hard contact, guess what? It's going to also lead to quality contact, and that's why the D-backs gave up so many hits. And it's also the kind of hits that the D-backs were getting because they were giving up so many hits, and because the hits are so powerful. The D-backs were number one in the extra base hit percentage allowed. No one was giving up more doubles, triples, and home runs on average than the D-backs. So when you look at games like the 8-0 loss to the Milwaukee Brewers, it's not a surprise when the D-backs pitching staff has given up more rockets than any other team. It's easy for opposing squads to make comebacks in your game if all they're getting is extra base hits. And that's a lot of what our team did this past regular season. And a specific group we would like to see it get a little bit better against. I mean, they weren't good against lefties or righties, but righties in particular, 773 OPS allowed against righties, way too high. So the first thing the D-backs need to do, allow less hard contact. The second thing, D-backs just need more swings and misses overall. Second worst strikeout per nine in the National League. And it's not a surprise. Who on this D-backs team has great strikeout stuff? Justin Martinez, Zach Gallen, Brandon Pfaadt. Ryan Nelson has some, put away potential, but then like outside of that, who do you really trust? Kevin Ginkel, I guess, too, but there's not a ton of guys that could come in. Maybe there's some runners on. It's a big moment, and you have to get the strikeout to survive. There's not a lot of guys on this D-backs team that could do that. AJ Puck could definitely do that. 14.2 strikeouts per nine. Sometimes you can't allow the contact. Sometimes the ground ball out will kill you. Sometimes the flyout will kill you. Sometimes you need that big strikeout because it's the only way you're going to get out of the inning. And this D-backs team, this pitching staff, does not have enough guys that could get that big strikeout. So would love to see some more swing and miss potential this offseason. The third thing, starters not giving enough length. That was a big thing we talked about all year, right? Jordan Montgomery never felt like he could pitch past 5 innings. Same with Erod. I mean, if Erod pitched 5 innings, you felt great. It felt like every start was 4 1/3 innings pitch for Eduardo Rodriguez. Zach Gallen was leaving starts early with cramps. So was Merrill Kelly leaving starts early with cramps. Like this D-backs pitching staff, in terms of the starters, never gave this D-backs team length. And so it puts so much more pressure on your bullpen, which leads to my fourth thing that the D-backs need to improve. The bullpen did not pick up others this season. So when your starters are struggling, they're not giving you length. You're going to need a good bullpen to pick those guys up to close out the games and pick up wins for your squad. And the bullpen did not do a good job of doing that either. Highest percentage of inherited runners scoring in the National League. What does that mean? When the bullpen came in and they were runners on, those guys scored more than any other team than NL. So if your starters were not going deep into ball games struggling, and then your bullpen came in and they were also allowing all those runners to come on from the previous starters and relievers, like it just a confluence of different things that lead to losses, especially really bad losses that lead to the D-backs not making it to the postseason. So for me, those are like the four biggest areas of weakness for this D-backs pitching staff that they need to work on for next season. And I'm sure there's even more that I haven't mentioned today, but for me, allow less hard contact, get more swing and miss potential. The starters need to give the pitching staff more length, and the bullpen needs to do a better job of picking up others. D-backs staff, once again, below league average in save percentage. And I feel like that has been the case every single year I've been doing this Locked On Diamondbacks podcast. So let's pray things can finally change next season for Arizona. And we'll discuss if we'll see Christian Walker back in the D-backs uniform in segment number 3. And hey, if you're looking to place a little wager on an upcoming NFL or MLB game, then I suggest going to FanDuel because, hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play by play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. My favorite thing to do on FanDuel is the same game parlay. Give me the Saints money line. Give me Derek Carr over on total touchdowns and give me Kamara over on receptions. When that hits, it brings a big smile on my face. And if you want a big smile on your face, visit fanduel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. And if you're planning to buy tickets to an upcoming game, concert, or whatever the event may be, then the best place to do that, of course, is going to be Game Time because Game Time is the best place for last minute tickets for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. They have this feature called All In Pricing. When you toggle this feature on, it shows you your total cost up front with no surprise fees at checkout. You could get a panoramic view from your seat before you buy, and they also have the lowest price guarantee, or Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. All right. Let's get back into the Locked On Diamondbacks podcast and let's do another player review as we'll be doing these all off season until we get some better news when it comes to free agency and more things to talk about. Right now, it's the off season, so we got a whole bunch of baseball topics that we have to get through this off season, like player reviews. This is something I want to end the podcast with every single day until we run out of players to talk about or interesting players that I want to talk about, because there are some guys that I'm not going to talk about when we're doing player reviews for 2024. Like, I'll go out there and say it right now, I'm probably not going to do a Jorge Barosa 2024 player review. I don't think he made much of an impact for the D-backs this season. I don't really even remember him playing for Arizona this year. Do a little bit more for Arizona next season, play like 30, 40 games, and maybe you could get a player review. But right now, Jorge, you are not on my list of guys to talk about this offseason. But Christian Walker, you are. And so we're going to talk about your strengths, your weaknesses, and your goals. And I think we could actually start with the goals on this one for Christian Walker before we even get into strengths and weaknesses, because there's one big goal that we have for Christian Walker, and that's to come back to Arizona next season. Right now, it's a moot point on what his strengths and weaknesses were, because if the D-backs do not re-sign their first baseman, it does not matter what his production looks like if it's not in an Arizona uniform. And right now, that is going to be a major question mark, and D-backs fans should buckle up this offseason for worst case scenario, as you guys are accustomed to, as we just saw the way the regular season ended. You guys should be used to worst case scenarios. I believe Christian Walker is going to come back to the D-backs next season. I believe Mike Hazen and Ken Kendrick will open up the pocketbook and pay Christian Walker, a guy who was a diamond in the rough fine, a guy who is the best defensive first baseman, a guy with the clutchness ability and the power ability and the run production ability. Like, Christian Walker, one of the most underrated players in baseball. But the issue is Spotrac knows he's underrated, and Spotrac knows what his value is. And so right now, according to Spotrac or Spotrac, however you say it, tomato, his market value is considered $22 million annually. And considering, I don't think it helps that the last couple of $20 million contracts the D-backs gave out to Erod and Jordan Montgomery, those were major blowups in the face of this organization. Now, I don't think Erod should be viewed in the same class as Erod and Monty, considering he's been in the organization the last few years. I know he dealt with some injuries this year, but doesn't have the same health history of a Erod. I expect, better physical health overall than Jordan Montgomery for Christian Walker. And so, in terms of stuff like that, I wouldn't really worry about Christian Walker, but that price tag of 22 million is very high. And I wonder if that gives the D-backs front office just a little bit of pause. If we could get that number to like $18 million over a 4-year deal, I would definitely lock in Christian Walker. But if it's $22 million, like I'm not against that price tag of annual salary. I'm just not giving Christian Walker 22 a year for like 6 or 7 years. But if he wants 25 a year, I'll even do that if it's like a 3-year deal. The D-backs offered Walker 3 years, $75 million with like an opt out or something like that. I would not be upset at all. So the goal number one for Christian Walker, bring him back to the D-backs in 2025, and then let's pray he can just replicate the last 3 years because that's all we need for Walker. From Walker, just do we have already done the last 3 seasons. And what is that exactly? Well, now let's dive into his 2024 year. We'll start with his strengths. What are his strengths? Power, defense, clutchness, starter killer, and a Dodger killer. Christian Walker, another monster season in terms of power. He had 26 home runs in 130 games. Definitely felt like if he played 157 like last year, he would have at least hit 33 and maybe would have cracked that 36 mark they hit in 2022. The power was once again there for Christian Walker. Looked at all the advanced hard contact stats, exit velo, hard hit percentage, barrel percentage. Christian Walker's like top 25 to like top 10 and like all those metrics. So the hard contact stats are there. Defensively, he's still the best defensive first baseman in the sport. You'll go on Fangraphs, you look at all the defensive metrics. Christian Walker is still that dude. So his two biggest pillars of what makes him, and like his player profile, power and defense, those two things are still there. Still displayed a ton of power from this season, and the defense was still elite. Clutchness, this seems to be more of a controversial topic for Christian Walker because I can't deny there have definitely been times when you watch Christian Walker where the runner's in scoring position and you just want to pull your hair out. Last season, Christian Walker below 200 average and a 750 OPS with runners in scoring position. But this season, not the same case. Way better. 254 average and 826 OPS with runners in scoring position. So basically, he just put up his normal slash line with runners on this season, which is all you would want from a Walker. He was also a starter killer. We talk about this D-backs team being elite early in games, right? We were the best first inning team in the sport this season. Not surprised, Christian Walker, also a very good early game player. First inning, 880 OPS, and innings 1 through 3, he had the best OPS of any 3 inning group. Innings 1 through 3, a 1014 OPS and a 331 average this past season. Incredible stuff by him early in games. And also, just from a fun standpoint, Christian Walker, Dodger killer. That's the main reason we got to bring him back because of what he can do against LA this past season. 9 games, 34 at bats against LA, 14 hits, 13 runs scored, 15 RBIs, 9 home runs, and 34 at bats. He had a 412 average, a 765 OPS, and he had 43 total bases. By far the most production he's done this season against any other team in the sport. Like in interleague play, that was 36 games, 136 at bats. He had 9 home runs in interleague play. He had 9 home runs against just the Dodgers. Triple amount of home runs as any other team he faced this past regular season. And it's funny, the other team he faced with the most home runs allowed against Christian Walker, the LA Angels with 3 allowed. So he really loves going to LA to hit some bombs. So great job by Christian Walker there. Those were definitely his strengths from this past season. But his weaknesses, he definitely falls off late in games. We've talked about great innings 1 through 3. Well, the same can't be said for his other inning pairings because it gets a little bit worse. Innings 4 through 6, 705 OPS, 220 average. Innings 7 through 9, 180 average, a 619 OPS. And it's not a surprise because Christian Walker, 873 OPS against starting pitching, but 203 average, 694 OPS against relievers. This is a guy who is not good late in games, and that's something he definitely has to work on going into next year. Also, highest strikeout rate since 2018. We got to work on Christian Walker's play discipline. It's something that has been such a strength for him the last few years. Sub 20% K rate, I think, the last 2 years. But for some reason, this year he went back to striking out a good amount. So a little bit less strikeouts for Christian Walker entering next season will go a long way. But number one on the bingo list for Christian Walker right now, re-sign with the D-backs for a reasonable price tag, and let's run it back and get back to the playoffs in 2025. Now, that's it for this edition of the Locked On Diamondbacks podcast. Come back tomorrow for more Diamondbacks news coverage and insight. We'll be doing the Ketel Marte player review and so much more. And as always, stay safe, stay healthy. Douse.